As always, thank you for sitting, for resting. When we gather like this in satsang, the core invitation is what could be described as the direct path. And what that basically means is the direct pointing to awakeness. Normally we can think of awakening or the spiritual path as, well, being a path that takes time. And so when we gather like this, it's an invitation to remember that that which we're seeking is already here, always already here. It's the natural state that underlies all states. So I always like to start gatherings like this with meditation, with silent sitting. And in essence, that's the real teaching. Silence. Recognizing silence, recognizing that you are silence. That's it. So when we gather like this, oftentimes a lot of words are shared. And I like to remind people that that's all commentary. The real teaching is the silence. So the full strength teaching has already happened. Now starts the commentary. And so because we started with meditation, I thought it might be useful to just explore meditation. Because the way that I describe meditation is oftentimes a little different than it's usually used. Meditation, especially when it's tied together with a path or a technique of effort and focus on a certain mantra, on a certain chakra, on a certain part of the body, on a certain visualization. In essence, it's actually concentration, because we're focusing the mind, focusing the attention to one point. And of course, as a byproduct, the mind stills. But when I use the word meditation or true meditation, it's not about that. It's not about effort. It's not about focus. We could say it's about unfocusing. Some meditation traditions, they, as their goal, they have something that's called nirvikalpa samadhi, which means you're coming into a state of absorption with the formlessness. And that's okay, but even that needs to be let go of at a certain point, because this that we're looking for does not need to be maintained through effort. Initially, it might be useful to do that, but it's useful to also understand that at a certain point, what the awakening process unfolds for us is that that nirvikalpa state holds itself without effort, and it's doing it all the time. This is the, on some level, the paradox of what we're doing here on the spiritual path. We're attempting to bump into reality as it already is, which is fully awake. And somehow we're walking around already fully awake, but not recognizing it. So we get on a spiritual path. Oftentimes we start to meditate, which is all great. But if we don't have this invitation that this thing called awakening, this thing called natural wakefulness, if we don't realize that it's always already here, we can stay sort of in this looping mode of seeking, and it's endless. Oftentimes people's challenge is when the mind is so busy, it can become an obstacle. It's true. And so it can be useful to use a concentration technique whether that be a mantra, or focusing on a certain chakra, or the body. I love the body. And the reason I love the body is it's so simple. It's just here. When you feel the body, you're dropping out of the thinking mind into direct experience, we could say. Direct experience of sensation. As a byproduct of that, the mind will slow down. And that's good. It's good to have this recognition of, as opposed to sort of having the desire for stillness or a quiet mind being forefront, it can be useful to approach it as a byproduct. So dropping into the body as a byproduct, the mind slows down. If we can go more directly, straight to awareness, straight to stillness, straight to the transcendent presence, likewise the mind will quiet as a byproduct. But it's not a direct seeking of that. And this is the trick for people, especially meditators, to when do you jump tracks? And this can be the challenge, especially for long-term meditators, is they're very practiced in their technique. They can be very good at manipulating states, stilling the mind. It's almost as if a neural pathway in the nervous system has been developed, so they're very good at it. But this that we're seeking for is not about a certain state that can be maintained in meditation. Or it's not about manipulating the mind so that it's focused on one thought or one point so that it quiets that way. And this is the trick, is when you let go of the effort of the mind, sometimes it'll backlash and become busier. But that's okay. This is where the direct path, its invitation is, let go of the mind. Just let it be. Let everything be. Let the mind be busy. Let the mind think. Just give it full freedom to go crazy. The emotions, the body, the sensations, just take your hands off the steering wheel and recognize that there is this space that surrounds the mind. And become more familiar with that. At first, the busy mind may appear to be an obstacle to that. But as you sit as that, as you rest as that, it becomes easier and easier to recognize it in all states, in all states, in all states. Of course, in a gathering like this or in meditation, it can be easier when you're by yourself, maybe in nature. There isn't a demand on you and it's a very easy situation. It can be easier to see that. And then most of us will hit this edge where the life situation or engagement or our internal experience arising will take us to the edge, and then we lose it. And we get pulled back into the mind activity, the mind identity. And there's contraction again. And now the mind's an obstacle. That's okay. But the more this embodies in us, it's always, we could say, a half step away. Recently somebody gave the metaphor of looking at a 3D picture. And for those of you that know what I'm talking about, you look at this picture that's taken in 3D or something, and you to see the picture, you have to unfocus your visual field. You have to loosen up the visual field, and then you see it. It kind of pops up. I love that metaphor because in some way that describes liberation right there. Not necessarily with your visual field, but if you could do that with your awareness itself. Just loosen it up and just rest as that. That's what enlightenment is. And the mind can spin, the emotions can spin, the body can do whatever it wants, the energy can move and flux, and yet you're resting as that no state. That's maybe initially found outside of experience, but eventually it's recognized to be right at the core and center of experience. At the core of contraction, it's still there. You're the eye of the hurricane, we could say. And so I often encourage people to use techniques that work for them. I tend to be, I tend to like simplicity. So simple techniques like breath and body sensations, these are very useful, and they don't require any special initiation, or they can be tuned into anywhere. And especially the body sensations, at a certain point we recognize how powerful it is to feel the body deeply. People that are awakening, the common challenge is that they can know that awareness. They've awakened to that witness, to that spaciousness, and then things arise and there's a challenge to deal with this intensity of emotion that arises. And I often get this question, how do I work with this? How do I deal with this? And I often share techniques a lot and different psychospiritual modalities. But I always like to remind people the first step, at least in this invitation, is space. If you haven't found space, if you haven't rested as awareness, the techniques are relatively ineffective. But when you can rest as space, when you can rest as presence, when you can rest as awareness, all techniques become more effective. And if you want a powerful technique for transmuting emotions, be in the body. That's simple. Most people we get caught up because the efforter, the doer, wants to fix and do and manipulate, and they get scared. But if we could literally just stay with the sensations, and because what's happening when we do that, when we're resting as awareness, is the separation between awareness and objects, between awareness and form, between awareness and body is dissolving. So it's embodying here. And there's an incredibly powerful transmutation energy and power in that. And so the traditional non-dual pointings are to point towards awareness. Get out of the mind, get out of experience, find this space that's beyond experience, that all experience, that the entire universe is happening within. And that's the initial pointing. Eventually, there'll be a deeper invitation. And the deeper invitation is where that witnessing awareness wants to recognize its non-separation with the mind, we could say. That's something that has a tendency to happen on its own, and yet it can be useful to have the invitation and the recognition that that's what non-duality is. And so back to that invitation to rest as awareness. We can rest as the witness to experience. But when the witness and the witness collapses, we could say that we're sitting as oneness. And we could say we're resting and sitting as love, meaning the non-separation. Sitting as the recognition that everything is consciousness. So in essence, true meditation is just resting as a natural state. Or as Ramana would say, abide as the self. So my invitation to you is the same as it is when Ramana would sit with people in silence. There's nothing going on. But rest as that, sit as that, be that. Not because you're seeking anymore. Just express it through your sitting.